already recording now. Okay. Well, good evening. My name is Kaylee. I am the assistant librarian here at the Gilford Public Library. We are very glad to have you all join us here tonight for our joint program with the Thompson-Ames Historical Society. This is the Great Sheet Boom. I'm going to let Steve introduce himself because I have nothing to say, but Kathy wanted to say some things first from the Thompson-Ames Historical Society, if that's all right. She just wanted to jump in and say some stuff, and thank you all for joining us.
On behalf of the Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you. We're very fortunate, or have been fortunate for the last few years, to team up with the Gilford Library to present a program on historical significance. Thanks to the Rotary Club, who is helping, it's a collaborative effort, the Rotary Club and the Historical Society, to renovate the L of the 1838 row house. And one of the big exhibits that we are planning when the project is done is to have the shawl, outlining and showing without our spinning wheel and a loom, all the steps from raising the sheet to the finished product of having yarn and then or weave into a blanket. So that's why we teamed up and we wanted to have Steve Taylor. I heard him speak on one of the schoolhouses, and I know he's very impressed. Yes. Our next program in October, we will be teaming up with the Parks and Rec, which will be a first-time experience for us. On October 9th, our program at the Meeting House will be on New Hampshire gravestones and cemeteries. And then October 20th, we will, thanks to the Parks and Rec, we will be going on a hike at 10 o'clock in the morning to a gravestone that most people know absolutely nothing about. It's a gravestone and a cemetery plot of a Civil War veteran, and it's close to the Alacoida State Park, and more information about that will be coming. And then our very next program is with the Laconia Historical Society on October 15th, which is in a couple more weeks. So, and more information will be coming from that. So we hope you enjoy our collaborative effect on me. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Sounds like you have all kinds of activities coming up. It's okay, don't worry.
Sorry.
Wait a minute, so do not move the podium. Just self. Well, anyway, all right. There's all kinds of wires here, so I can. Well, I'm happy to be with you this evening. I have been doing these talks for the humanities people for a few years, and it's a great experience to travel around the state. Just admiring the library as I came in. And, you know, one of the things that, having been in way over 100 different communities doing these talks, to see the investments that have been made by communities in libraries around the state in the last 15 and 20 years, it's really sort of under the radar. Nobody really takes much note of it, but town by town, we really have accomplished a great deal. You know, even the little tiniest towns where they have taken a one-room schoolhouse and put an addition on the back end of it. You know, they got a functioning library, and they have become very increasingly important, really, in community life, doing the kinds of programming that you were just talking about, and serving really as the sort of, since the Grange faded away, churches have kind of shrunk, and they're sort of really the linchpin of a lot of communities around the state. And people have, in many instances, have really very, let's say, ingeniously have financed improvements in their libraries, oftentimes building new buildings, on and on. I have to tell you about one town that I appeared in, and it's Rockingham County, and I walked in, and this library is absolutely stunning. It's just beautiful. It's like, God almighty, how did this happen? And they said, well, here's how we did it, you know. We kept saying to the budget committee and the selectmen, we want to build an upgrading library. And they kept saying, nah, well, this isn't the year. They always say that. This isn't the year. And they persisted. They kept pestering these people. And finally, the powers that be said, well, you go out and raise money. And whatever you can raise, we'll put in a matching amount in the budget. And I figured that would take care of that. And so, by golly, these people went out and they raised $3 million. So, well, hand and on, but I think they put up almost $3 million to match. And, by golly, it's just a lovely, lovely, lovely library. But it's used for all kinds of activity. You know, it's something going on in that building all the time. And so impressive. Well, anyway, I've been doing these talks and have kind of a catalog of them I've built up. And this is the one I'm going to do for you is the first one that I started out with. And I've built on that. You've heard about that I do one about one-room schools, and I do one about the Grange movement and its alignment with the progressive politics of New Hampshire, early 20th century, when so many reforms came about. And I do one on poorhouses and town farms. Just about every town in New Hampshire in the 1830 to 1870 period had a poor farm. And it was a great experiment, but it went very, very sour. And the towns quite wisely said, heck with this, and they kicked the problems up to the counties. And the counties would spend about part of a century wrestling with the identical problems that the towns had, managing the poor people in their midst. And it's a great, fascinating story. And more recently, I've put together a talk about the political decisions that were made in Concord in the 1950s about the location of highways, either for upgrading or the routes the interstates would take, and how that is played out in communities and regions of the state, for better or for worse. And it's a very interesting exploration. And a lot of it was raw politics at the time. You had regions pitted against each other for the routes, and then you also had communities that didn't want a new road to come through, and they did their damnedest to stop them and to send them to the next town over the hill or whatever. But it's a fun story, and it's within the lifetimes of most of the audience, so we can have a really interesting discussion about it. But anyway, so much for that. I'll talk to you about the sheep boom and its enduring legacy on the landscape of New Hampshire. And to set it up, I really have to talk about the clearing of the land of New Hampshire. Imagine European settlers coming here beginning in the 1620s, and they faced some terrible challenges. First of all, bringing enough food with them to survive. There was nobody here that was going to feed them. And so that was challenge number one. Number two was the climate that they came to. It was unlike anything back home. And what we have here in New Hampshire and New England is what climatologists call an extreme severe climate, where we can be in the 90s like we've been this summer, and in a matter of 5 or 6 months we can be 20 or 30 below zero. And so that great range presents all kinds of challenges. And then there was the biggest, well, you had hostile populations here in some instances. The First Nations people, or Indians, or Native Americans, or whatever is your preferred term, in some instances were not welcoming. In other instances were somewhat welcoming. But unfortunately for those people, what the European people brought with them were horrible diseases for which these people had no immunities, no barriers, and most of them were killed by things like diphtheria and typhus, and even things like whooping cough and measles. So anyway, had that. But the biggest challenge of all was the forest. The forest, the vast forest of New England land is 95% forest, and about 65% of that forest cover was hardwoods, and much of the forest cover was beech tree, almost the dominant species. And beeches left to their own, they'll grow 5 or 6 feet thick. And so how in the world can we get agriculture going if the land is all treed over? So what they set out to do was to clear the forest in a most brutal way. And they spent the better part of 200 years clearing the forest. And the most common, a lot of the softwood, of course, was harvested for timber, for saw timber, lumber. But the hardwood, they didn't have the technology to process mass quantities of hardwood into lumber. And so, but the imperative was to get the land cleared as soon and as fast as possible. So what they used was very simple. They used fire. And it was a practice called stubbing, in which you take a hatchet or an axe and girdle the tree. And that would kill the tree in a year's time. So the second year there'd be no leaves on the tree, and the sunlight would shine down through and hit the forest floor, and they'd begin to scratch around and plant oats, wheat, barley to get grain production going and forage production going. And after 5 or 6 years, the dead tree would have dried down enough so they could set fire to it. They'd build a fire around the base of the tree and get it blazing and burn down much of the tree. But a tree that's 5 or 6 feet thick will not burn through readily. And so they would end up with these hideous stubs of blackened tree trunks scattered all over the landscape. And that is the reason that this practice was called stubbing. So after 10 or 15 years, the roots on the stub would have rotted enough so they could take oxen and hitch chains on and pull these things over and get them out of the way and end up with what we call today a field, a meadow, a pasture. And we have no conception of the toil and danger that went through. And think of the pollution from the burning, just chronic burning all the time. Incredible. But by 1800, it's hard to imagine that they had cleared south of the White Mountains about 80% of the land area of New Hampshire. Wow. It's just incredible to think about all of that. Well, of course, the early agriculture was subsistence. It was to feed themselves, grow some grain, and support livestock, primarily the cow. The cow is very, very important to the survival of European settlement here, because the cow is a marvelous machine. The first documented importation of cows to New Hampshire, 1634, down in the Portsmouth area, and those cows were added to eventually over a period of many years. Many of them apparently, from what the research studies show, many of them originated in Holland and Denmark. But anyway, they were brought here. But the cow, look what the cow can do. She is so amazing. She produces milk, and what milk can be converted into is storable protein and fat for the human diet. Add a little salt, you can have butter, you can have cheese, and it can be stored. And the cow produces meat, her muscle can be smoked or cured, and that makes food for humans over the long winter. The cow produces leather, a very, very important commodity in early settlement. Leather used for just dozens and dozens of different applications, such as footwear and clothing, of course, but things like hinges and all manner of other things. The cow produces offspring. And if it's a female, that's added to the herd, it builds the herd. And if it's a male, it's castrated and becomes an ox. And oxen were the primary motive power of agriculture and forestry and transport for roughly the first 200 to 250 years of life in New England. And even into the early 20th century, there were many farmers and loggers who preferred oxen to horses, they're more docile. and easier to work with. And of course, another important factor is this: we do not have a dietary custom of eating horse meat. All right, so if a horse comes to the end of the line, we're not going to eat it. You can go to Belgium or over there today and you might get horse meat. You don't even know it, but not here. But an ox comes to the end of the line and we slaughter it, it's beef, all right? Very simple. And then the cow produces a marvelous product every day. It's called manure. Right? Well, this is barren granitic soil here, so the addition of manure to the soil helps us grow better crops. So I just have to emphasize the importance of the cow in early agriculture in New Hampshire. Well, post-American Revolution, we have enough animals and enough crop productions getting going so that we have a bit of a cash commercial type agriculture. Surplus commodity can be marketed and gave rise to an interesting occupation called drover. Somebody who would go start up country, perhaps up in this area, assemble some cattle or assemble turkeys or hogs or whatever, and drive them down the road to markets in Boston or down towards southern New Hampshire where you had urban populations growing. Anyway, that gets us to 1809, which is the critical year. Thomas Jefferson is president of the United States, and he appoints a Boston businessman named William Jarvis to be the American consul to the Spanish court. Well, Jarvis obviously was politically connected. He was a very successful businessman in Boston. But for some reason, and we can't really figure out why, he owned a magnificent farm in Wethersfield, Vermont, directly across the Connecticut River from Claremont, New Hampshire. And anyway, Mr. Jarvis had a keen interest in agriculture, as many people did in those days. He arrived in Spain, and one of the first things he did was go out in the countryside and take a look around. And there he saw magnificent flocks of sheep. Sheep unlike anything back here in the New World. Sheep with fleeces that were this deep, heavy wool sheep. And up to that point, the European nobility had embargoed their good breeding stock from being exported. They didn't want the competition that might come about if they let some of their prize animals go. But at this point, the Spanish court was under imminent threat of invasion. The Iberian Peninsula was about to be invaded by Napoleon and his hordes, and they need to raise money to wage war. So Mr. Jarvis and an Englishman put together a deal to buy about 15,000 of these wonderful sheep. We use a sort of a generic umbrella term for the sheep of the time, merino, but there actually were several breeds represented, but merino is good enough. So anyway, Mr. Jarvis had half of these he acquired, and he arranged to have them shipped to New England. Well, some came through the port of New York, some came through the port of Boston, and some through Newburyport. Now you think about moving some sheep in a boat. It would take 60 to 80 days to get here. You had to bring enough water, you had to bring feed, you had to have somebody to tend them. I mean, that's a pretty high-risk proposition. But Mr. Jarvis had the resources to do this. Now you think, obviously in those days they didn't have any ethics rules. There was nothing that prevented him as an officer of the United States government from making some money on the side. Right? Well, he reserved 300 of these magnificent sheep for his own farm, and they were landed at Newburyport, and they were driven 110 miles overland to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. Wow. And it's just amazing to think what was done to get that going. Well, soon after Jarvis and the Englishman's deal, others started getting in on it, and a number of other investors, you might call them, or speculators, started purchasing these wonderful sheep and arranging to ship them here. And at the peak, over a period of about a 5-year period, sheep were received at ports like Wiscasset, Maine, and all the way down to the Virginia Tidewater country. The word soon gets around about the arrival of these incredible sheep, and people say, "Woo, we want to get some of that breeding stock to breed to the sheep we've got here to improve their wool production. We really want to do that." And it was a classic case of a bubble, just like the .com bubble, boom, that just sprang up, and everybody is getting in on the deal and wanting to have a piece of the action. And so, in a matter of just a few years, the numbers of sheep on the ground exploded. It just grew and grew and grew. My little town, Plainfield, in the Connecticut Valley, in 1812, had about just under 1,000 sheep. And by 1824, they had 10,000 sheep. You see, and you can say, "Well, so what's the math?" And I can do a spreadsheet that shows if we kept back 40% of the females that would have been born, you could build those numbers pretty rapidly, even allowing for death losses and everything. So, and this was happening all over the place. Everywhere were these people, farmers, and it would become the only period in New England history where farmers got rich from agriculture. They made fortunes, they made money. It was an incredible period. The wool was very valuable. And as this resource was becoming available, it attracted capital to build textile mills to process the wool into fabric, okay? So in New Hampshire, every place there was water power practically, a mill would spring up to process the wool. Places like Pittsfield and Franklin and Lebanon and Claremont and Newport, or Somersworth, these places where there was water power attracted Boston Capital primarily to construct what they call manufactories to process all of this wonderful resource that was abruptly becoming available. You can go to Claremont, and they have an area in the community that's on the Sugar River where there are waterfalls and there have been dams and paths, and there are 6 magnificent, huge brick mill buildings. And on the oldest one, the cornerstone says 1816. Drive around. A lot of these, of course, buildings were made out of wood, and they're long since gone. They've burned down or been demolished. But these brick structures, many of them persist, exist today. Many of them are being repurposed into office space and heaven knows what. Now you say, well, Manchester, you know, the huge mills there. Those were not woolen mills. Those came later. Those were cotton mills, which came along later. Anyway, well, we have all these sheep, and the numbers are just staggering. The numbers of animals are huge, and we're often running dramatic growth in numbers. The values were pretty high on these sheep. A good breeding ewe would be worth about $4 at a time when $1 a day for labor was top money. You figure you could work all week and buy one breeding ewe. So it tells you the value of these animals. And as this evolved, it was soon obvious there were some great challenges and great problems that had to be overcome. Number one was the matter of confinement. How in the world do I keep my sheep separate from your sheep and your sheep separate from his sheep? We've got a big challenge. Well, we've cut down all the forest, not much in the way of trees left to make fences out of, and steel wire, not yet been developed. But we had something in great quantity that was very handy to make fences out of. Stone, rocks, all right? So, in an amazing period, time. In about 50 years, right after the American Revolution, through the beginnings of this period I'm talking about, in New England were constructed over 250,000 miles of stone walls. I mean, that's an incredible feat in itself. It's just amazing to think what they did. A lot of them were built by the farmers themselves, but there are also contractors, you might call them, from Scotland and from Italy, who build walls and would go traveling around to erect walls. Incredible what they were able to do. Most of them 4 feet high. Keeps a sheep in, won't keep a cow in, all right? We're all over the place. So today, you walk through the woods, any place there's a stone wall, at some point, that land on either side was cleared, and sheep were grazing there. Just keep that in mind. A great undertaking, those stone walls. Getting enough feed. We have a very short growing season here in New Hampshire. It's only about 5 months, so we've got to put up stored feed for 7 months to carry these animals through the long cold winter. And that meant harvesting hay. And they harvested vast quantities of hay on a lot of this open land to put in storage. And that involved every single male above the age of 10 years old. You became proficient with the scythe and how to sharpen the scythe and how to swing it. And they had no soccer camps, no, Xboxes, Twitter, or anything like that. If you were able to stand up and walk, you would learn how to swing a scythe. And it was a huge undertaking. Of course, once the hay was harvested, they had to cure it and gather it up and store it away in barns. The third challenge was predators. This is the natural habitat of the eastern timber wolf. Now cutting down the forest had pretty much destroyed its habitat, but there were enough around to continue to cause trouble. And so it was absolutely imperative to, if there was a sighting or some sheep had gotten killed, to drop everything and hunt the wolf down and kill it. And so that occupied a lot of energy. Anytime I've given this talk over in the Monadnock region, over around Keene, Cheshire County, somebody will always put their hand up and say, well, do you know why the top of Mount Monadnock is bald? There's no trees up there. And I always say, no, I know what. And they say it's because the sheep farmers got so fed up with those timber wolves that were hiding in the crevices up there in the woods and the brush, that they went up there at one point and they set fire to the whole top of the mountain and flushed those wolves out. And in the Hampshire Historical Society, they have a wonderful drawing of a hideous, ugly-looking wolf fleeing flames, and a farmer drawing a bead on it, about to shoot it as it escapes the fire. Well, it's, myth probably, but it's a great story. And then, damn if they don't say Mount Cardigan the same way, that's why it's all the yeah. So, dealing with those predators, they pretty well exterminated them after a matter of time. Next big challenge was parasites and disease. Anytime you build up the numbers of ruminant animals, you start to have problems with parasites, all right? And the parasite I'm talking about is, we call it today, vernacular, it's very simple, is stomach worms, all right? These are nematodes that live in the sheep's gut. They don't kill the sheep, but they debilitate the sheep, make the animal susceptible to things like pneumonia, other kinds of things, they'll eventually kill it. And these parasites have a very simple life cycle. They live in the sheep's gut, they shed eggs, eggs pass out into manure, attach themselves to the underside of blades of grass, sheep come along, eat the grass, consume the eggs, and just repeats the cycle. And at that time, of course, they didn't have the pharmacy
that we have today, the drugs that we can throw at stomach work. They're still around, they're still a problem. But we have lots of new drugs that have been developed that can keep those parasites under control. But at that time, one of they tried all kinds of what we call homeopathic remedies to try to do it. And my favorite one is this. They would take a commonly grown plant that everybody around here grew. And they'd take that plant and they would press it to get the juice out of it. And they'd take the juice and make a tea and force some of this tea down the sheep's gum. Now, what do you suppose that plant was? Tobacco. Tobacco. So anytime there's a kid in the audience, I say, listen, if that stuff in that tobacco can kill worms in the sheep's gut, think what it can do to you. But anyway, so they use that. And then another affliction very common to sheep is what we call foot rot, basically infection in the cleft of the hoof. And again, it won't kill the sheep, but it makes sheep lame. Sheep lies down all the time and loses condition. It begins to become debilitating. And again, they turn to tobacco, the juice of tobacco plants to treat foot rot, along with a bunch of other pretty powerful concoctions. And then they had ticks. And there's some evidence that the ticks that afflict sheep even today may have come with some of Jarvis's early shipments. You know, it's a native of Europe, the common sheep tick. But whatever, to deal with that, they had all kinds of remedies. And the one in my town that I always have gotten a kick out of was this. After they finished shearing in June, they would dam up a brook and dump a bunch of arsenic into the pond, all right? And then drive the sheep through it and soak that stuff onto their skin. Well, obviously they didn't have any EPA. So that's always a problem. But the biggest problem they had was malnutrition. Now they started haying. The tradition was to start cutting the hay on the first Monday after the 4th of July. Well, we know today that the peak nutrition of the first harvest of grass comes right around Memorial Day. So you go over to the Connecticut Valley last week in May, and most of the first crop hay has already been harvested. Those big dairy farms, they want to get that peak nutrition. But these people were harvesting the first crop of hay when it had already lost probably 30% of its nutritive value. And now they didn't cut all the hay on the first day of harvest. They cut hay all summer long. It's all hand labor. And so by Labor Day time, hay would be, a lot of it would be about as nutritive as sawdust. I mean, it was, you know, terrible, horrible stuff. So these sheep had to get through the winter on pretty poor quality rations. And the result, of course, was they had a lot of losses. Sheep died. They had a wonderful set of diaries that I've read, and the fellow's talking about January, I shed a dead sheep today. February, father and I shed 2 dead sheep today. You know, they're getting that wool, but they're having to drag a dead sheep's carcass out of the barn. And that was largely due to malnutrition. Now, in those days, they thought if they got an 85% lamb crop, they'd done pretty well. What that would mean if you had 100 ewes and you expose them to ram in November, come the 1st of May, you'd end up with about 85 live, healthy lambs, okay? And what that meant was that some of those ewes never conceived because they were already depressed nutritionally. They may have miscarried during the course of the pregnancy or whatever. But you see, they just weren't getting. Today, a 200% lamb crop is the goal. And if you're below that, probably you've got some things you need to address. You've got to check out and fix. So that malnutrition was a chronic, difficult problem. There was a simple annual cycle, lamb them on pasture. They like to do that because the mothers with the new babies would have more milk from eating good green grass early part of May. And then they would shear in June, separate the lambs from the mothers. And most maintenance models that were followed were pasture on upland. And that's why you find stone walls way up on the side of mountains, virtually. And that's why they'd carry the animals over the summer. And then, of course, the meadowland down along the rivers and the streams and so on, that was where you had to grow the hay. And then breeding, as I said, in late fall, wintering in very simple shelters. In other words, they focus more on having a good barn to hold the hay. And very often they simply had a lean-to type shelter for them to keep them out of the real coldest wind, and they just put the hay out on the snow and carry them over. But losses from poor diet were pretty severe, and that was just a fact of life. The sheep numbers in New Hampshire, 1834, it was sort of the peak year. New Hampshire had just under 500,000 sheep over 1 year of age. That's a lot of sheep. Vermont had 1.1 million, Maine about 600,000, Massachusetts 370,000. The town of Gilford had 2,300 sheep. That's a lot of sheep. And I could put together the towns right around in Belknap County, and I could add them all up, and I'd come pretty close to 50,000 sheep. All right? That's more sheep than are in all of New England today. So I think about Gilford having 2,300 sheep. That's a lot of critters, a lot of animals. And we really, it's hard to believe how many there were. Well, comes the year 1837, and the bubble bursts. The boom, just like that. It starts going downhill. There was the economic panic of 1837 caused by Andrew Jackson. He abolished the equivalent of the Federal Reserve, and the currency reverted kind of back to the core of the economy, went back to state banks. So you had the State Bank of New Hampshire, State Bank of Vermont. And here in northern New England, there was a real rampage of counterfeiting. Crooks over the border in Canada counterfeited a lot of the currency here. So when commerce, you had to discount money to compensate for the possibility that it was counterfeit. The Erie Canal had been opened and railroads were being developed to the Midwest. That facilitated the movement of wool from the Midwest into New England and depressing the price that our farmers here were able to get. Now, there's no agricultural commodity that we can produce here in New England that somebody can produce somewhere else, bigger, better, faster. And so if they oh, maple syrup, go up to Quebec. They make 3 times more syrup than we do here in New England. And everything else, it's bigger, better, faster somewhere. And then the Industrial Revolution was beginning. And so people working indoors more, they didn't need heavy woolen garments so much. They kind of liked cotton, which was just beginning to come on. And central heat and the box stove were perfected. Didn't need so many heavy woolen blankets. So, you know, the demand for woolen textiles was beginning to shrivel. But the biggest factor of all was the exhaustion of the soil. Too many sheep for the capacity of the soil to generate feed to carry. And that was really the bottom line. And so as early as 1840, we began to see the abandonment of pasturing on higher elevations particularly. There's a wonderful study done by a professor at Plymouth State, Professor Blaine, about the town of Sandwich, where she tracked the distribution of agricultural activity in Sandwich by decade, from 1840 all the way down to modern time. you know, every decade, less and less and less and less. And this was happening everywhere. What we call today going back to the Indians, where Mother Nature wants everything to be farmed. As soon as they stop pasturing, up come the trees. And so that 80% cleared land began to go back to forest. So it's exactly flipped now. About 80–85% of New Hampshire is forested. So that's a century and a half. Pretty amazing. That gets me to looking at the two big legacies that are tangible of this period of prosperity, of all this activity with sheep. Number one is the stone walls. As I said, 250,000 miles of stone walls built in New England. And we're down now to less than 100,000 miles. A lot of them were used to build roads. When the bulldozer was perfected and heavy trucks and all that allowed the development of the state roads of New Hampshire in the 1920s and 30s. Stone walls along roadsides, perfect material. Just pull them in and make a base for a highway. And so a lot of them were lost that way. Another factor was a federal program that was around the 1950s and 60s, where the U.S. Department of Agriculture would give farmers a check to hire a bulldozer and make a great big hole and push all the stone walls they could into the hole and then cover it over with dirt. And that was called obstruction removal. Now, that's to facilitate modern farming equipment, you know, make fields big and efficient for harvesting. And so a lot of them went that way. And then in more modern times, we've lost a lot of our stone walls basically for what I call, let's call it landscaping, architectural usage. Stone walls are very valuable, and people take them up and sell them to these dry stone masons and do stone walls around estates and mansions and so on. A few years ago, my late wife and I went on the ferry from Hyannis over to Nantucket to take a look around. And on the ferry with us were two 10-wheeler dump trucks, and they were loaded with stone wall material. There's no stones on Nantucket. And later on, I wondered if maybe some of those stones were headed for Mr. Madoff's mansion or something. But man, exorbitant money. So stone walls are, you know, they're still under pressure. And the New Hampshire legislature has passed legislation to make theft of stone wall material serious, more serious misdemeanor crime or whatever. The other tangible legacy, of course, is the architecture. You know, commonly right around, particularly in central and western New Hampshire, people say, "Oh, look at that pretty colonial house." Well, I guarantee you, the colonial times, before the American Revolution, there was no such house that looked like that. People were living in hovels at that time. You know, they slept with the cows to keep warm. After the American Revolution began to improve. But during the period of the 1820s and 1830s, there was money in the economy. And people embellished houses, they built more elaborate houses, and those are what we remark upon today. And also, a lot of public buildings were built. So magnificent churches, town halls, and of course the mill buildings, the legacy of that period. Over in my country, Plainfield and Cornish and Heartland, Vermont, right across the river, at that time connected by a ferry, there are 7 beautiful little brick churches. And they all look the same. They're almost the same, made with native brick. Very pretty, they endure today, they're still in marvelous condition. All built 1832 to 1837. People had money to build a lovely church. And so that's where we are. Anyway, but there's another legacy of that time that I have talked about, and it's a social one, a cultural one. after the great sheep boom burst, the bubble burst, there was nothing to come along to replace it in terms of generating the kind of income and profits that the sheep boom had generated. We tried all kinds of things, you know, orchards and chickens and dairying and all these. Nothing ever compared to the money that was generated by that sheep boom. So, beginning in 1860, rural New Hampshire began to get hollowed out, and people were packing up and leaving. A lot of people went west to California or Oregon, to even places like Wisconsin to farm. Others packed up and went to work in the great mills of the Merrimack Valley or in eastern Massachusetts. They just left, and we had this horrendous decline, shrinking of rural communities. Now, towns that had a mill and they had railroad, they didn't suffer as much. But little hill towns, they shriveled. It was incredible the way it happened. My town, 1860 to 1890, lost 30% of its population, 40% of its tax base, because people went away and there was nobody to buy the properties that they abandoned. Nobody wanted them. You know, they were just gone. They had left and nobody to pick it up. And there were many aspects to this, but I think what you could accurately say was there was a melancholy that settled on rural areas. And it was the same in Maine and western Massachusetts and Vermont. And there's a lot written about it. People felt so sad. So the people who still were here were just wondering what could be done to turn it around. How could we get people to come back? How could we get enthusiasm, optimism restored? You know, it was sad, really. That gave rise really to the Grange movement in New England. People were hungry for some kind of a social institution that would bring people together and cheer them up. You know, Grange meetings, they'd have a business meeting and they'd have some entertainment. Somebody would sing some songs or play the piano, or recite poetry or whatever. And then afterwards you have egg salad sandwiches. Why egg salad sandwiches? Very simple. Everybody had chicken. Why? But anyway, so it was a feeling of loss that settled in. And politicians and everybody that was running for office, they had to say what they were going to do to turn this around, try to restore some of the population that had been taken away. There were a number of different interesting manifestations. The Board of Agriculture of New Hampshire, beginning in the late 1880s, would publish lists of properties that could be bought for cheap money that had been abandoned. They were just being carried by the town as, you know, nobody wants them, but the town's responsible for them. Sort of. These lists were circulated in Boston and New York. You know, they might say 100 acres with a house and sheds for $425. You know, 75 acres, $100. You know, and people in Boston, New York, see that. Wow, maybe that's what we ought to do. Get a summer place or something. And so that's the beginning of summer people in a lot of rural New Hampshire. And often when I'm over in this part of the state, I bump into somebody and they'll say, you know, my great-grandfather, bought our place for $300 in 1896. And we wouldn't sell it for $900,000 today. You know, nice, maybe a place up with a nice view, a classic cape or whatever, and a big old barn or whatever. Those were hot properties for people from down country that had money. Another manifestation that I'm always amused at was Governor Frank Rollins, the governor of New Hampshire, 1898. Now, politicians in that time, they all had to say what they were going to do to turn this population loss around. It was like today, you know, they all say they're going to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. They never do, but they say they're going. In those days, what should be done? Well, Frank Rollins came up with this idea. He said, you know, we have lovely weather, end of July, early August. Let's have a festival in each town where we'll have good food, we'll have music, we'll have people, orators, we'll get people who went away to come back and see how great it is here. And they'll consider repopulating, coming on back, because it's so nice here. Okay? Well, it didn't really work, but his idea is the basis, or the founding seed of something that we call Old Home Days, or Old Home Weeks. And his idea spread to Maine and Vermont, Massachusetts, and there's still a lot of towns in those states that have Old Home Week. And Old Home Week in New England vernacular, it became a sort of a shorthand for a lot of people around, you know. My late wife used to say, you know, there'd be a whole bunch of kids running around in the house. And he said, boy, this is just like Old Home Week, you know, all these kids coming in to visit. So anyway, that was another manifestation of that. One other is in my part of the state. There's this huge game preserve. We call it Corbin's Park, and it was founded by a man named Austin Corbin. He was a son of Newport. He was a banker, a lawyer, and kind of a robber baron. He owned the Long Island Railroad, and he founded Coney Island. And he wanted to have a game preserve. He came back to Newport, and he sent agents out to buy land. He could buy it for pennies of an acre in 5 towns, and it includes a mountain range right in the middle of it, the Grantham Mountain Range. And he put together this vast game preserve and put up a big fence all the way around it for about, I think it's 24,000 acres. And he stocked it with wild boar and elk and bison, and it was a private game preserve. And it's still there. Hard to believe, but it exists still today. And they still have, they don't have any bison left, but they have these others. But he was able to put that all together because of this vast transfer of population away. And he would send his agents around to the towns and bought the property that they had listed. And any survivors or people, hangers on inside his proposed park, they went to them and said, look, Mr. Corbin's going to have wild boar here and elk, and you can stay if you want. We'll give you a key so you can go in and out the gates. But they said, whoa, you know, how much do you give me for the place? And they all left just like that. I mean, they just got flushed right out. So I find a lot of towns, particularly Grafton County, Sullivan County, well, in Merrimack, well, almost everywhere, where you can find incredible declines in population. 1860, 1,800 people. By 1940, 200. You know, I mean, just losing, you know, as much as 80, 85% of the population, because we didn't have any real good agricultural enterprise that we could offer that would give people a decent living. So, while that's all going on, we reforest, the trees all come back, and not only was, I have to say, not only was the melancholy occasioned by the shriveling of agriculture and the reversion to forest and the exodus, also the horrendous losses that were suffered in the Civil War. You know, a whole generation of young men were lost in that time. So anyway, well, I'll take you to today. We talk about back in the boom times. Wool, a sheep could generate in today's dollar terms, probably $100 or $150 of cash flow. Today, wool is worth almost zero. It's hard to believe. We don't have any big flocks of sheep left. We have a lot of what I call bo-peep flocks. Somebody has 5 or 6 or 7, 4-H projects, whatever. And there's several itinerant sheep shearers that go around. There's a girl from Salisbury, she comes up in our area, and she'll charge, you got 2 sheep, she'll charge you $50, and she'll shear them. And then you have this beautiful fleece sitting there, and people say, wow, you want to buy that, or will you take it? Nope, put it in the dumpster. You know, there's no use for it. Well, why is that? Well, 25 years ago, you had an L.L. Bean catalog, you had an Eddie Bauer or Land's End. Probably half of the items for sale in there were wool. Well, what are they today? Fleece, right? Fleece made out of melted down soda bottles. And people shifted to them, and so the demand for wool has just shrunk. And the mills that we used to have, one by one, they went out of business in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. The last one to go out was Door Woolen. It was owned by Pendleton of Oregon up in Newport. And now all it is a great big concrete slab where that mill used to be. And others vanished similarly. And so nobody's doing it. So there's one big woolen mill that's in St. George's, Quebec, and they produce fabric for places like Brooks Brothers, pure wool. Some is used for carpet, but more and more is simply synthetic fiber. People just, it's just not a big thing. Anyway, dairy farming, we tried to make that. Got up to 1905, we had 129,000 cows. Today we got about 13,000. At 1905, we had 9,000 farms milking cows, and now we're down to about 90. In 1905, there were 147 rail stations where milk was received for transport to Boston, and no rail stations today. Anyway, so I'll wrap it up. People often say, well, what do you got that we could read that would expand on this? I say, nobody's done a PhD dissertation yet, but somebody will do, I am sure, on this period, and that'll be great. But for the stone wall, I'm going to give you the definitive book. It's called The Granite Kiss. Anybody know what a granite kiss is? You get a black and blue on your fingers from dropping them. It's stone rock when you're trying to lay up. And it's done by a guy named Kevin Gardner. And I don't know, have you had him come here and speak?
Yes.
Oh, yes. He does this lecture. I cannot believe. He did it at the Cornish Fair a couple of weeks ago, right on the fairgrounds. You know, and all these people gather around watching this guy. He comes with 2 of those white 5-gallon buckets full of pebbles, and while he's doing his lecture, on the table in front of him, he's building a little miniature stone wall. And he never pauses. He hardly even looks down. He just lays it up. And when he's done, you got a little stone wall about 4 feet long, about that high, that thick. It's beautiful, unbelievable. You know, and then when he's done, people have finished asking questions. It's time to go home. He just takes his arm and he sweeps all those pebbles off into his bucket. It's terrible. But he does it's a wonderful lecture. But he's written a definitive book about stone walls, especially in New Hampshire. I mean, he's a guy, he can walk through the woods and he can say, that wall was done by Scotsmen. You know, this wall was laid up by farmers. That wall was done by Italians or whatever. The good walls that endured today, you know, they were well done, they're strong. They dug down a little bit, like building a kind of a footing underneath them. And they've done well. Others have just about disappeared down into the leaves and the dirt. The frost action, you know, weathering and everything, they've shrunken and shrunken and shrunken. There's a book called A Building History of Northern New England by a New Hampshire academic type guy, James Garvin. It talks a lot about the early architecture of hay barns and sheds and so on. The Vermont Heritage Network at UVM, they have a lot of material about agriculture. And then there's one called The Field Guide to New England Farm Architecture by a guy named Thomas Visser, who also does a marvelous lecture about the buildings and how they've evolved over time. Well, I'll wrap it up with this. I just mentioned this little booklet here. It was published in 1925, written by James Walter Goldthwait. He was a professor at Dartmouth College, a professor of geography. And the book is titled, A Town That Has Gone Downhill. It's about Lyme, New Hampshire.
Oh.
And he did what Professor Blaine did up in Sandwich. He just took Lyme decade by decade, and he wrote about the abandonment of the sheep industry, the closing down of agricultural enterprises up on the hillsides, and little villages, little settlements would be along brooks where they could dam up and have a little mill to have a grist mill or whatever. How that's all just faded away. In 1925, it was down to pretty much what Lyme looks like today, is 2 villages and some agriculture right on the Connecticut River. So there, I've talked long enough and my time is just about up. And does anybody have a question or a comment they'd like to throw in?
I have a comment. You mentioned the advantages of the Grange in Hampshire. When the Gilford Grange disbanded, they sold their building to the Historical Society for $1. So as you leave the library and you turn right, that big white building is what we call the Grange.
Yep.
We have different displays.
Now, had that building previously been a church?
No.
It was built as a Grange
It
home?
was built as a store.
Okay.
And the
all right.
Grange met the store
Yeah.
opposite us.
Yeah.
And then when the store went out of business,
Yeah.
they bought it for the Grange meetings.
Interesting.
With a huge, beautiful copper sink. And the story is that when they would have their potlucks, they would just open the windows up and pass the dirty dishes directly into this big copper. Oh, it must be at least longer than that.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah, the Grange in its heyday was just a potent organization. They had a huge membership, and they had 340 chapters around the state. I mean, they were in every village. And
we can thank our mail delivery to the efforts of the Grange.
RFD going, that was one of them. The establishment of the University of New Hampshire at Durham was a Grange initiative. It had been at the Dartmouth, and Dartmouth hated it. They persecuted it. And the Grange, long story, but the Grange's intervention in politics and stuff got it moved down to Durham. And the Grange advocated for things like child labor laws, regulation of utilities, the railroads especially, of worker compensation, of direct election of United States senators, a whole bunch of those things. And they were very strong in terms of advocating for education. And you can make a good case for that being due to from the get-go, the Grange, when it was organized in 1867, included women as full equals. That women had every power to vote in affairs and hold any office in the order. And I said that very important, the concern for children, welfare, of improvement of highways, to improve life, all those things. So Grange had a big input. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
I have a question that may not be, I don't know. Anyway, how long did it take for that wonderful quality of the merino wool to come down, or did it? Because of all the challenges they faced. They didn't have the same conditions that they had in Spain. So what happened to the quality of that wool?
Well, the genetic potential of the merino is very powerful. So if we had poor quality British origin sheep, we could breed, the first generation would carry half of the genes of the merino, and we'd breed again the next generation. By the time you got to 3/4, you had a pretty solid replica of the true merino type. You'd have good wool production. So it didn't take long to dramatically upgrade the quality. Of course, these merinos that we're talking about in that time, they had very wrinkly skin like this, so they had a lot of surface that grew up. But you talk to the Australians today, they hate Jarvis. They say Jarvis was totally wrong. He should never have brought those around. Well, they've all gone. You don't find wrinkly merinos anywhere in the world today because it's too hard to shear them with modern machinery. In the old days, they used hand clippers, snip, 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 and they could, you know, do it by hand. They could get most of the wool. But today, with power shears, a wrinkly sheep is a problem, and so they bred away from that. Yes.
What's the life expectancy of a sheep?
5 to 7 years. Some are tougher and will hold up. It's a big factor of nutrition, really. Well fed, they will last. Now we are getting sheep, females born, let's say in February and March. We can get them pregnant the following December in less than a year, but that requires good feed so they grow well.
And the other thing is that they must have created quite a bit of lamb or mutton, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Most of the people here owe their origins to the British Isles, which had a very strong dietary custom of eating lamb and mutton. But it's interesting today, 80% of the lamb consumed in the United States is consumed in the region, well, a slice from Portland, Maine to Baltimore, Maryland. You go to Arkansas or go to Illinois in a supermarket, you can't find lamb that's nowhere to be found. So, I mean, we eat it here, but now we're getting more ethnic populations that like lamb. They would really rather have goat, but they will eat lamb. Particularly Muslims, people from places like Bosnia, you know, Sicily. Well, in the 70s at our farm, we raised quite a few sheep, and we were in the ethnic lamb market. We would raise a suckling lamb to 40 pounds, and Greeks and Sicilian Italians would come and buy them and slaughter them. And those were Easter ceremonial feast lambs. But the next generations, they're not so into it, and it faded away very rapidly.
My understanding was that if you talked about the per capita consumption, that somewhere, say, 1900, 1920, 1930, there was more land consumed than meat in the United States per capita.
Right, it was in New England, yes.
No, I mean, I never heard about it in New England.
Well, I suppose on the high plains, yeah, they would have done that. I don't think if you went to the deep south, you'd find many people that had land.
No.
Yeah.
We went down in deep south.
No, I see what you're
There's
saying.
this tiny little corner where they have a couple of frozen lambs.
Yeah.
But no, I'm talking back then, and it's rather interesting. And I didn't know that to be honest with you, I didn't know they raised lamb or sheep in New England. I thought it was much more of something that was done because I always remember the fight between the cattlemen and the sheep herders.
After 1850, Vermont was slower to abandon than we were here. In other words, our soil gave out faster. Vermont has richer soil. But in the 1850s, out of the 1 million sheep they had, about a third of them went on rail cars to the west to establish flocks out there, and the rest were slaughtered, and then it just shriveled down. There were estimated about 9 million sheep in what is now Spain and Portugal at the time of Napoleon's invasions. And Napoleon seized about a third to a half of them and brought them back to France. You know, it just, war booty, really. And the rest of them were either slaughtered to feed the soldiers or basically driven into the sea, and they died of exhaustion. They just cleaned out the whole industry. Anybody else? Yes.
I basically have two questions. One, Steve, I was wondering how many people in the audience raise sheep or have raised sheep.
We had a couple as pets.
As pets.
I thought it was interesting because you mentioned they had like one sheep. Usually our two ewes would have twins.
Yeah.
Did the merinos have twins or was it?
Oh, no, we want twins, and
Yes.
You're getting twins shows that your animals at the time that they were being bred were at a good nutritional plan.
Well,
They
I
were
was
well
at
fed.
the grade.
Yeah, there you go, see?
They were pets.
You were doing well, yeah. Yeah, they repaid your hospitality.
Yes.
I used to raise sheep and goats in England, and I was always fascinated, you know, in the 70s, we started subscribing to American magazines, The Shepherd, and how they were so filled with encouraging people who were raising sheep to eat their sheep and ways to cook it. And it used to amaze me because although I grew up initially in New York City, you know, we grew up eating lamb. That was, you know, Sunday roast for us, and of course, eventually going to England, it was a good part of our diet. But you know, and even now, you talk to people about eating lamb, and they turn up their nose at, you know.
But there's lamb that you buy in the store, which I don't buy.
Yeah,
Or it's like if you go to Joyce Keyser of Rambling View Farm, the Shepherd's Hut,
yeah,
and she's at the farmer's market every Saturday
Yeah.
morning, may I say? But she also has recipes of how to cook it.
yeah, how to
And she has the herbs that kind of bring out the flavor. And, you know, it's frozen, but
Right.
and you can order what you want ahead of time.
A big impediment to developing lamb as a local meat is the fact that slaughterhouses will tell you it takes about as much labor to process a lamb as it does to process a meat. You have to go through all the same steps. And at the end, you have a yield of, you know, 100-pound carcass instead of 1,000-pound carcass. So that's a problem. Yes, sir.
The gentleman that gave the money for this library, his farm still raises sheep, and you can buy lamb from him.
Wonderful.
Rambling
He gave the
View.
money for this library.
Yeah.
Big persons.
Yeah. Sheep Fortunes did a lot of good things around New Hampshire. Smith College down in Massachusetts was founded with a big chunk of money raised by a prominent sheep family up in Sullivan County, New Hampshire. And, you know, you find those examples all over the place. People did well. Well, okay, thank you. I think we'll have to-